Deep inside Europe, a piece of Russian land sits isolated like a chess piece abandoned beyond cold borders. It is not connected to the rest of the country, yet it still contains cities, seaports, and military forces. Poland lies to the south, Lithuania to the north and east, while the Baltic Sea opens to the west. To reach Russia by land, residents must cross the territory of other countries. At the same time, this small region holds a naval port and supply routes watched closely by many nations. By ordinary logic, a territory separated like this should be too fragile to survive for long. Every train, truck, and pipeline must depend on rules beyond Russia's direct control. If overland transit were disrupted, goods would have to take longer routes across the sea. Costs would rise, journeys would lengthen, and ordinary residents would immediately feel the weight of geography. A small disruption in transport or security could quickly become a problem for the entire Baltic region. Yet the city remains illuminated, ships still dock, and hundreds of thousands of people continue living there. Trains still cross borders, ferries still sail, and administrative systems continue linking the region with Moscow. This survival is not a miracle, but the result of history, logistics, and strategic calculation. That territory is Kaliningrad, a Russian region between Poland, Lithuania, and the Baltic Sea. It faces separation, wartime legacies, and a geopolitical struggle that has continued across generations. Before becoming Russian territory, this coast was home to ancient Baltic communities living among forests and lagoons. Its position between rivers, lagoons, and the sea made it an early meeting point for trade. In the 13th century, the Teutonic Knights built a fortress here and named it Königsberg. The fortress quickly grew into a city, protected by brick walls and sustained by merchant ships. Controlling this gateway meant collecting taxes, protecting vessels, and gaining access to the Baltic Sea. When the Teutonic state weakened, the territory became the Duchy of Prussia in the early modern period. Königsberg gradually became East Prussia's administrative center, far from the major cities of the West. The city held more than soldiers and merchants. Its schools transformed it into an intellectual center. The Pregel River linked warehouses, shipyards, and neighborhoods, keeping the city permanently oriented toward the sea. As the Kingdom of Prussia expanded, Königsberg became a symbol of a state growing in power. Under the German Empire, East Prussia remained its easternmost province, far from the nation's industrial heartland. After the First World War, Poland gained access to the sea, separating East Prussia from the rest of Germany. Long before becoming Russian, this land had already experienced life as a detached piece on the map. Trains had to cross Polish territory, while shipping became an important alternative connection. The new borders created disputes because ordinary transport now depended on relations between sovereign states. Isolation did not cause war by itself, but extremist forces exploited it as one grievance among many. When the Second World War spread across Europe, Königsberg's strategic position became a deadly weakness. Air raids in 1944 destroyed many historic districts and burned much of the city center. In the spring of 1945, the Red Army surrounded the city and ended German control there. As the fighting faded, the city still stood, but the political world around it had completely collapsed. After the war, the victorious powers had to redraw the borders of a shattered Europe. The Soviet Union wanted direct access to the Baltic coast for both security and naval operations. At Potsdam, the Allies agreed in principle to transfer Königsberg and its surrounding region to the Soviet Union. The decision awaited a final peace settlement, but in practice, it created new control almost immediately. East Prussia was divided, with the south administered by Poland and the north absorbed by the Soviet Union. This was not an accidental gift, but part of the wider reconstruction of post-war Europe. Soviet forces took control of ports, stations, and surviving infrastructure across a devastated landscape. Most German residents had fled, died, or were forced to leave their homeland after the war. People from many parts of the Soviet Union arrived and began building an almost entirely new society. In 1946, Königsberg was renamed Kaliningrad, deliberately breaking with its German past. The new region was placed inside the Russian Soviet Republic rather than the Lithuanian Republic. Russian replaced German in schools, government offices, and the public life of the rebuilt city. Many old ruins were demolished as Soviet apartment blocks and broad avenues appeared. Baltic and other regional bases were developed into a major center of the Soviet Baltic fleet. The old trading city was transformed into a military outpost near the east-west confrontation line. Although far from Russia, Kaliningrad remained linked to Moscow through Lithuania and Belarus within one union. The borders between Soviet republics existed on paper but rarely disrupted everyday movement. Fuel, food, and soldiers could move as though traveling between provinces of a single country. Kaliningrad therefore did not feel like an exclave, even though it belonged to a different Soviet republic. Its first solution depended entirely on one condition: the Soviet Union had to continue existing. For decades, Kaliningrad operated as a restricted region where security shaped the functioning of the entire city. Railways, ports, airports, and barracks formed one logistics network serving both civilians and the military. Baltic offered reliable sea access, allowing ships to operate when northern ports faced winter ice. The port gave Moscow the ability to maintain naval forces inside the crowded Baltic region. Shipbuilding, fishing, and industrial facilities helped the region sustain an economy of its own. Farms and new towns reduced the distance between military bases and civilian life. Schools, hospitals, and government offices strengthened Russian identity among settlers from across the Soviet Union. The border with Poland was surveyed, marked, and turned into a permanent post-war frontier. To the north, the Lithuanian boundary remained internal, creating stability that depended on the Soviet system. By 1990, the final settlement concerning Germany accepted the borders created after the war. But at the same time, Lithuania restored its independence, turning an internal line into an international question. At the end of 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed, and the political bridge linking Kaliningrad to Russia disappeared. The tracks did not move, but trains now crossed fully sovereign independent countries. Kaliningrad officially became a Russian exclave with no direct land corridor to the mainland. Journeys once treated as domestic now required passports, customs checks, and transit agreements. The most common land route to Russia crossed Lithuania and Belarus before reaching the mainland. Sea routes avoided land borders, but depended on ships, ports, and Baltic weather. Air travel provided faster connections but could not replace the enormous capacity of ships and railways. The federal government had to maintain funding, special laws, and transport systems to keep the region functioning. Special economic arrangements were tested to attract investment and offset the costs of isolation. Cross-border trade with Poland and Lithuania once offered the chance to make Kaliningrad a gateway for cooperation. But Poland and Lithuania increasingly integrated with Western political, economic, and security institutions. In 2004, both joined the European Union after already becoming members of NATO. Kaliningrad was now surrounded on land by countries belonging to both the EU and NATO. Special transit documents were created so Russians could continue traveling by train through Lithuania. Geographically, Kaliningrad is an exclave. It belongs to Russia but is separated from the mainland. It is not completely landlocked because Kaliningrad has a coastline and direct access to the Baltic Sea. The region survives through 3 layers of connection: land transport, sea transport, and air travel. Roads are flexible for passengers and smaller cargo, but every vehicle must cross an international checkpoint. Railways carry far greater volumes, but trains remain bound by schedules and inspection procedures. Different goods face different restrictions, making law itself part of the logistics system. Transit passengers do not simply cross the border. They travel under conditions negotiated by governments. Russia owns no sovereign corridor through Lithuania. Movement exists through agreements, not Russian territory. Sea transport bypasses land checkpoints and moves cargo between Kaliningrad and Russian ports. Some ferries carry both railway wagons and trucks, turning their decks into moving sections of road. However, ferries run less frequently than trains and remain vulnerable to storms, ice, and port congestion. Air transport handles urgent cargo and passengers, but high costs limit its role for heavy freight. Electricity and fuel once depended heavily on networks crossing the Baltic states, creating another vulnerability. To reduce dependence, the region expanded local power generation and built additional backup capacity. Gas can be stored or delivered by sea, providing insurance when external networks face disruption. Food and consumer goods often use multiple routes because no single connection is reliable enough alone. The system resembles a 3-legged stand. If one route fails, the other two must carry more weight. Ports therefore act like pressure valves, increasing cargo flow whenever roads or railways come under strain. Behind every shipment lies an invisible network of customs, rules, schedules, insurance, and permits. A train may be mechanically ready to move, yet still stop when the legal framework no longer works. Kaliningrad's greatest value begins with its position on the southern shore of the Baltic Sea. From here, ships can reach routes connecting Poland, Germany, Scandinavia, and the Baltic states. The short distances mean sensors, aircraft, and ships based here can influence a much wider region. The Baltic base allows Russia to repair, refuel, and deploy vessels without leaving the Baltic. Air defense systems form a protective layer around ports, bases, and the surrounding airspace. Radar near the central Baltic can observe maritime and aerial movement across considerable distances. Missile systems stationed in the region can complicate military planning in neighboring countries. From Russia's perspective, Kaliningrad is a Western shield and a deterrent against military pressure. From the neighbor's perspective, the same systems create pressure very close to their borders. One location can be a strategic asset for one side and a source of anxiety for another. Southeast of Kaliningrad lies a narrow strip connecting Poland and Lithuania, known as the Suwalki Corridor. This corridor lies between Kaliningrad and Belarus, placing two strategic zones across a narrow distance. It is also the main overland connection between the Baltic states and the rest of Europe. If this route faced a crisis, land access to the Baltic states would become far more difficult. However, the Suwalki Corridor does not belong to Russia and is not Kaliningrad's private supply route. Its importance comes from security scenarios where terrain determines speed, access, and reinforcement. Civilian routes and military supply lines often use the same bridges, stations, and road junctions. Kaliningrad now resembles a chess piece deep inside the board, influential yet permanently exposed. The deeper a chess piece advances, the more pressure it creates, but the farther it stands from support. Kaliningrad's weight comes not from its size, but from the routes and distances it can influence. Every border lengthens transport time because inspections and documentation cannot simply be ignored. When political relations worsen, ordinary regulations can quickly become sources of dispute. A change in restricted goods can force companies to shift entire supply chains toward maritime transport. Residents must consider visas, flight routes, and checkpoints for journeys that are simple elsewhere. Local businesses pay extra for reserves, insurance, and multiple backup transport options. Greater reliance on the sea also requires more ferries, docks, crews, and cargo handling capacity. Air travel is fast but vulnerable to changes in airspace, fuel costs, and flight permissions. The region requires substantial federal support to maintain infrastructure and offset geographic costs. Special incentives can attract production, but they also make the economy vulnerable when policies change. Land reserved for bases and controlled zones can limit space for civilian development and tourism. A large military presence creates jobs, yet also ties the local economy to defense decisions. Identity here is complex because old German architecture survives beneath a modern Russian society. Many traces of Königsberg have vanished forever, leaving history present through absences that are hard to see. For Germans, Poles, Lithuanians, and Russians, the same place can awaken very different memories. Even the landscape carries older layers, from lagoons and forts to neighborhoods rebuilt after destruction. The more militarized Kaliningrad becomes, the more valuable it is for defense, and the more exposed it is in crises. During tension, every exercise or new system can be interpreted by the other side as a possible threat. Ports, railways, and power plants are strengths, but they are also fragile points of concentration. If one major hub stops working, pressure quickly shifts to routes that already have limited capacity. Redundancy makes Kaliningrad more resilient, but maintaining parallel systems is always more expensive than one direct route. Its location places Kaliningrad constantly inside the security planning of many different governments. Neighboring countries monitor ports, military activity, and infrastructure to reduce surprise during periods of tension. Russia responds by treating the defense and supply of the region as a permanent strategic priority. Beneath every strategic calculation, residents still work, take children to school, and live ordinary lives. The more strategically valuable the chess piece becomes, the more nearby civilians pay for every movement of the board. The greatest transformation began not with gunfire, but when a vast country suddenly disappeared. When Lithuania restored independence, Kaliningrad's most natural land connection fell under another country's sovereignty. Months later, the Soviet Union ceased to exist, leaving Kaliningrad inside a Russia redefining itself. In a single historical moment, a domestic rail journey became a route through several international borders. Passports, customs, and transit rights became essential conditions for transportation across the region. Infrastructure designed for one unified country had to operate in a world of multiple governments and laws. Every freight wagon now depended on whether different sides recognized each other's documents and procedures. In the early post-Soviet years, broken trade links and economic decline made life in Kaliningrad difficult. Factories lost old markets, the military contracted, and many once stable jobs disappeared. At the same time, the new borders opened access to goods, visitors, and connections once restricted. Kaliningrad experimented with a special economic zone, importing components and assembling products locally. Russia sought convenient access, while Lithuania had to preserve control over its sovereign territory. As Lithuania prepared to join the EU, a new question emerged. Under which rules would Russians transit? Applying ordinary border rules would have made travel far more complicated for trains and passengers. Negotiations became a test of whether geographic separation could be managed through law. The solution was simplified transit documentation, allowing travel while preserving border control. Trains continued crossing Lithuania, but movement now depended on a conditional legal mechanism. In 2004, Kaliningrad's borders became an external frontier of the EU and a contact line with NATO. A region once deep inside the Soviet Union became a Russian outpost inside a Western security system. Physical distance stayed the same, but political distance from neighboring countries grew far deeper. The Baltic states saw the Suwalki corridor as a vital link, while Russia saw Kaliningrad as a position to defend. Both sides increased surveillance, defense, and mobility, bringing even greater attention to the region. The transformation proved that borders need not move to completely change a territory's function. Without a new war, legal changes alone can pressure fuel, goods, and everyday life. For Kaliningrad, the map did not merely record history. The map itself became the greatest event. After the post-Soviet shock, Russia strengthened sea routes to reduce total dependence on transit through Lithuania. Port facilities were upgraded to handle more trucks, containers, and railway wagons in less time. New power plants helped Kaliningrad generate more energy without complete reliance on neighboring networks. Gas storage and maritime receiving facilities created another backup layer during unstable external connections. Regional roads and railways were improved, so cargo arriving by sea could be distributed more quickly. Support from Moscow helped keep transport, public services, and infrastructure within local means. The special economic zone continued evolving to retain manufacturing and create employment. Some industries used the port location, while others relied on domestic demand and federal incentives. Amber, beaches, and Königsberg's heritage helped Kaliningrad build an identity beyond the military. Königsberg Cathedral was restored, showing that the German past was no longer treated only as something to erase. The city gradually accepted that modern Russian identity could coexist with earlier historical layers. During better relations, cross-border projects supported environmental work, trade, and local exchange. Checkpoints gained modern inspection systems, increasing speed while preserving border control. Emergency plans and strategic reserves were maintained so essential services could survive transport disruptions. The military practiced maritime resupply and protection of key infrastructure during isolation scenarios. Poland and Lithuania also upgraded roads, bridges, and defensive systems around important access routes. The Suwalki corridor was studied not only as military terrain, but also as civilian infrastructure. Every side developed backup options because no one wanted an entire system dependent on one road. The effective response was not a larger wall, but a network of routes able to replace one another. Kaliningrad survives not through a secret bridge, but through a network constantly adjusted to circumstances. The first misconception is that Kaliningrad is an island, although it shares land borders with two countries. It is also not enclosed inside a single country, because its northern and southern neighbors are different states. Because it has a coastline, Kaliningrad is an exclave rather than a completely landlocked enclave. Saying Russia has land in Europe can also mislead. because Western Russia already lies in Europe. What is unusual is not that Kaliningrad is European, but that it lies far from Russia's continuous territory. Kaliningrad was not handed to Russia through a random decision, but through the post-war settlement among major powers. It was not always as isolated as today. Under the Soviet Union, its transport routes were mostly internal. Baltic independence and the Soviet collapse turned administrative lines into international borders. Kaliningrad is not only a military base, it is home to families, schools, farms, and businesses. Most residents care more about jobs, prices, and transportation than distant military scenarios. The city is not frozen in the past. Its neighborhoods, ports, and services continue to evolve. Kaliningrad's importance becomes clear only when history, geography, logistics, and military power are viewed together. The old view assumed Kaliningrad could be protected simply with more weapons, fences, and troops. But even a strong fortress is weak if electricity, food, and transport routes are unreliable. Modern strength lies in generating power, storing supplies, moving cargo, and preserving transit law at once. Its forward position gives Russia influence, but forces constant investment to keep the chess piece supplied. A deep-positioned chess piece can threaten many squares, but every supply line remains exposed. Kaliningrad's security is also measured by whether hospitals, schools, and shops continue operating. The Baltic security environment is changing, forcing every port, island, sea route, and exclave to be reassessed. Trade, energy instability, and winter weather can affect the region as much as military exercises. Cables, navigation signals, and port data have become as important as railways and docks. Residents' future depends less on maps changing color and more on maintaining stable connections. Neighboring security also depends on clear rules, because misunderstanding can escalate quickly. Borders remain fixed, but their meaning changes with alliances, technology, and relations between states. Kaliningrad's unusual power lies in forcing every side to calculate carefully before making decisions. A territory does not need to be large to carry weight. It only needs to sit where major routes converge. At night, Kaliningrad still glows beside the Baltic, separated from Russia yet bound to European history. Inside old bricks and new railways, several political orders still lie layered over one another. Decisions made after the war still quietly shape trains, borders, and the anxieties of the present. On the stone chessboard, the isolated piece stands still, reminding us that modern maps never truly sleep.